Hi everyone, welcome. Well, this isn't a lot of food, that's for sure. As you can see, there's lettuce, cucumber, a tiny chunk of tomato in there, perhaps even a couple pieces of red onion. It's a pretty good sized juicy chunk of cucumber, a few of them. But for the amount of worms that are thought to live in this system, this is plenty. Even though it's been 2 weeks since we last checked in on these worms, I'm still anticipating maybe a little bit of leftover of the chunk of watermelon rind, perhaps the size of the palm of my hand, that was left for them over on this side of the bin. This is the castings boulder system, with the worms living in a tub here on top that has holes drilled into the bottom of it, with a sump beneath it that can collect the moisture. And alrighty. Sorry, I just thought I saw something there. So that enables us to be really generous with the moisture in here. So I've got my water bottle on the ready, and I haven't really been giving it a great deal of use nowadays. But in this system, I've been making a habit out of adding moisture pretty regularly, even though, as you can see, there is a fair bit of moisture in here already. If we feel that we want to add more, we can. Alright, well, it seems like our top covering piece of newspaper has gone to pieces, sticking to the plastic top covering. And that's okay. I've been wanting to keep the system super damp, and I guess the main reason for that is that these boulders that I've been referring to these chunks as, these little castings boulders, I always found that they were almost impossible to even break apart for the longest time, especially when they were still kind of dry and when they had initially been screened out of my worm castings collection. They're soft enough now to be individually broken up, but the whole idea was that the worms might eventually rip this stuff to shreds and leave it in a nice fine state. I guess to a certain point that is kind of happening here and there. Especially like down here in the middle, which is where we had been feeding most of the time. But most recently we altered the orientation of the feeding. Instead of placing the feeding pretty much center or just off center for the most part, we fed over here on this edge of the bin. So why don't we dig in and see how things are looking in here. We placed a piece of cantaloupe melon rind right over here in the middle, of which I could see a little piece of leftover still. And it almost even seems like there's a little bit of the fruit sticking to the skin, because the cantaloupe melon rind will typically get stripped clean of all the yummy fruit, leaving that thin, slightly harder skin for the worms to continue working on, but it won't go quite as quickly as the soft, juicy, sweet fruit goes. So that's kind of what I was expecting, even though after 2 weeks you might expect more of the food to have been depleted. Got to keep in mind that this system's populated with a fairly small number of worms. Following my typical method of determining the estimated worm count, I took everyone's estimates from the original launch of the system 86 days ago now, and averaged those numbers together to come up with an estimated worm count of 134 here in the system. And I've already had at least one person suggest that perhaps there's even more worms living in here than that. During the last check-in, we encountered a couple cocoons, or well, it could very well be that it was the same cocoon that we bumped into twice, although it seemed to me like that might have been a little bit unlikely. So the presence of any cocoons at all, I think in itself, is a good indicator to show that perhaps the worms are reproducing. And on the topic of cocoon, There we go. There's another one right there on my fingertip. And look at that. There's another one. So now we can't even suggest that we're bumping into the same one twice. We've actually got two separate ones here on my fingers. And I wonder if that could have something to do with the very small size of the population. The worms are sensing that there's space enough for more worms in here. And perhaps that's the reason they're trying to increase their population size to take advantage of the available space in here. Sometimes I also wonder if perhaps the reason for the reproduction is that it's sort of a panic response. Kind of like when a very, very small plant begins to flower, perhaps much earlier than it normally would because it's in a stressed situation. Sometimes I wonder if that could be the reason for reproduction in the worm bins, because they're really just trying to leave behind some cocoons just in case things do crash and burn, that they could have a recovery of their population with some hatching cocoons later on. This is kind of good to see too. At the very opposite end of the bin from where we fed last time, we're bumping into worms, telling us that this material is viable bedding for them to live in, which is good news. So I guess the whole idea behind moving the feeding from the center over to the far edge over there last time was to try to get the worms moving, trying to get them to go back and forth here in the system. And some people suggested a somewhat more complex approach to that by changing the feeding location such that it goes from one corner to the next, perhaps in a clockwise or counterclockwise pattern. I decided what we're going to do here is something a little bit simple, a little bit more simple, but pretty much in line with that same thinking, is that it changes, but this pattern that I plan to use is just what I refer to as the ping-pong approach, where we just go from one side of the bin to the other. So we'll feed on this opposite edge of the bin today, and then next time we'll just go back to feeding on the other side. And as you can see, I just grabbed what was remaining of this little bit of a little bit of watermelon rind, throwing it down here, kind of like what we did last time. We extracted whatever remaining bedding we still had in the center and used that as the foundation for setting up the feeding zone on the other side. And this time too, I've extracted anything I could find from the old feeding zone, bringing it over to the new feeding zone, kind of giving the worms no excuse to remain over there anymore, but rather to get moving, get over to this side of the bin to take advantage of the yummy foods that are being left for them, and sort of forcing the topic of worms traversing the system to get over to the newest edition of food and working the contents of the entire system down gradually. I don't know whether it's going to work or not. We'll have to see. It remains to be seen, but it does look pretty promising from what I've seen in here so far. I like what we're seeing. So I think we're going to keep at it. Now this piece of top covering newspaper definitely has seen better days, and sometimes I just try to see if I can squeeze one more use out of some of the resources that I use in my systems, and in this case we'll follow suit with my routine. So we'll just spread out what remains of this top covering newspaper out here on top, even though it certainly doesn't cover the entire system any longer. And I believe that next time we're in here, whatever does remain of it will simply get utilize the supplemental bedding down in the feeding zone. So that's it for our check-in with the Castings Boulders systems. As you noticed, I didn't add any moisture this time. Kind of intentional, because as you saw, the system's got a good deal of moisture already, and I don't think it's necessary, so I think they're going to be a-okay. So that's it for the video, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.